Actually, I'm a co-founder of a startup. I don't actually work for Plato, but I'm a mentor on the platform. And I am excited to be here with Doug Gaff, who's VP of Engineering at Zapier. So Doug, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk to you guys.
Awesome. So we're actually going to be doing, answering questions from the Q&A feature within Zoom. So anybody can ask a question. Feel free to start typing them in now. So at the bottom, this isn't in the chat window, but in the Q&A, there's a button at the bottom. You click on it, Q&A, you can put in your Q&A question. So I'm going to have this open and you can upvote questions. So even if you don't want to ask a question, you're welcome to upvote them. I know that since it's, we're not in week one anymore, right? People who've kind of been thrown into the remote world, they're, kind of adjusting, maybe seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. So the questions here don't have to be about, COVID-19 world and like doing things remotely. However, there is a lot of wisdom that we'll get from Doug because he was just mentioning that, they've had a fully remote culture for a while now. So there's a lot of wisdom I think that one can learn while things continue, as they are. That said, again, if you have general questions about engineering management, engineering leadership, if you have a particular scenario that's going on right now for you personally that you want to share, I mean, really anything across the board is welcome. So with that, maybe before we actually go into these questions, again, feel free to post them as you have them and upvote them as you see them. But I'd actually love to start, Doug, if you want to just share briefly like about your background, maybe even in context again of the remote work and like how COVID-19 and kind of the world today has been affecting you in your day-to-day role and kind of anything else that you want to share with the group.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, so yeah, I'm Doug, VP of Engineering at Zapier. I've been here about a year and a half. My other remote job was at Envision, which was roughly the job before this. I did a short stint at a larger company. My work has broken down into either fully remote, fully colo, or the mixed environment where there's half, there's people spread out everywhere. I can tell you that I prefer remote first, and then fully co-located second, and then mixed environment third. If I had to rank those structures, because the best thing about remote work is it's a level playing field. Everybody is remote, so there's not like office or hallway conversations that are happening that you're missing out on, for example. My background's electrical engineering, but I've had hardware software jobs up and down the stack for my entire career. And I've been doing management for almost 2 decades now. But I stay technical. I still build stuff in my basement and still hack for fun. Real quick on COVID. So Zapier as a company is a web automation company. We build the glue logic between APIs for 2,000 plus apps. And what's been interesting to watch as a company with Zapier is that our company has shifted as the market has shifted because a lot more people are remote now, and so they're using tools differently. And so we're seeing that usage play out in our own stats in our product itself. That's been interesting from a business perspective. Like everyone else, personally, we've been hit by the same things that everyone else has been hit. You have friends and family members that are sick. Everybody's at home, and you're trying to juggle childcare. We have all the same problems that everyone else is having right now. The thing that we didn't have to learn is how to do remote work. So that part we already knew how to do, and it was the other stuff, how to really lean in. And we're a very empathetic company anyway, but we had to sort of especially lean in for supporting our employees during COVID. So I'm happy to talk about that more as we get into the questions, but I'll stop talking and start answering questions.
Awesome, sounds good. Yeah, we have a few in already. So the first one, very relevant, right? Given you mentioning Zapier has been a fully remote org. How do you approach structuring your remote organization?
Yeah, so the honest truth is that there's not a huge difference between structuring in a co-located environment and a remote environment. The same patterns apply. So for example, engineering has got sort of 2 big chunks. There's the engineering, product, and design portion of engineering, which is the partnership with product and design for building our products. We call that the EPD part of the org, and that's the teams that build all the product stuff. And we're sliced so that each team has a vertical, a part of the product they own, top to bottom. And so those are EPD teams. They're organized into zones, and the zones report up into myself and the CPO. On the other half of engineering are the services org. So our product and production engineering team, which is infrastructure and SRE and whatnot, our security organization, and our data engineering organization. And we call them services teams because they service the entire company. So it's not just about engineering, but they provide all the capabilities for the whole company. So that's a common structure, like for a 200, 300 person company. That's a pretty common structure. the thing that you have to really pay attention to in remote work is too many direct reports in a remote environment is really tough because you don't have a lot of serendipitous conversations that you would like just walking around in the halls of an office. And if you have a ton of reports, like more than 6, say, you spend a lot of time just trying to support your folks and stay in sync with them because that's your primary job. And the more you have, the harder that is, the more of that your week it takes because you have to explicitly schedule all that communication time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's maybe one difference, but structurally we're very similar to other companies.
That's fascinating. I mean, I've always kind of heard that rule of thumb of like, 7 to 9, give or take, as it relates right to direct report numbers that are manageable. But I'm also hearing that when you're working remotely that you need to like consciously carve out a lot of time to connect because there isn't that serendipity. So I hadn't made the connection that because of those 2 factors, it makes sense to maybe have that number be slightly lower. But it's intuitive now that you pointed out. So it makes a ton of sense. That's great. So kind of shifting gears a little bit already, but I know that this one's a hot topic, right? We kind of have a set of companies that are doing lots of layoffs, and we saw Airbnb yesterday lay off 25% of their workforce. I actually chatted with one of the folks there yesterday about it, and he was like, I don't even know which members of my team yet. Anyway, but there's also this other set of companies that are in the opposite, that are exploding, that are hiring aggressively, particularly in any kind of like tools that one, can use to do remote work more effectively. So in that regard, regarding hiring, during hiring, how do you ensure people are solid remote collaborators? How do you test for that? How do you measure that? How do you determine that?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have our hiring process has several stages in it that most hiring processes do. There's a sort of a recruiter stage and there's a fit stage to make sure that you roughly have the skills for the job. There's a technical test and a technical evaluation, and then there's some interview loops that have you meet the team and get in a little bit deeper into your skills. There's one thing that we do at the end that's a cultural interview that's very explicit. For Zapier, it's conducted by someone outside of your department. For starters, it's typically 2 people that participate. And what this thing does is it checks for cultural alignment with the 5 values that Zapier has, which are transparency, empathy, no ego, default action, that kind of stuff. Like we have some really core cultural values that really drive the way our company operates. And those values make a good remote employee because, for example, default to transparency, when you're fully remote, your job is to tell everybody what's going on, like to not hide things in Slack or whatnot. You have to sort of publish what's happening and default to that as a behavior. If you don't do that in a remote environment, nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows what you're doing. Nobody knows what's on your mind. And so we explicitly interview for these things to make sure that we're finding people that fit this. The other one that's really important is empathy. Electronic communication, other than excessive use of emojis, doesn't really convey tone terribly well. And so we do make excessive use of emojis. Like that's how we try to convey tone, but tone can still get lost in communication. And when you're a highly empathetic person, you assume that people are acting with best intent when they're communicating with you. So if a tone comes across poorly, you assume they actually just need something and they're trying to communicate with me. They're not trying to insult me or anything like that. And having that kind of mindset really helps you work in a fully remote environment. That said, like people have to learn to do it. Like if you've never done it before, regardless of what company you start at, if you're fully remote, you have to learn to work remotely. And so there's the first few months are super intense for any employee as they're trying to figure out how to be a remote employee.
I believe that. It's interesting because kind of a similar vein, it's like, it's not like you're looking for a completely different type of worker or type of person, right? But there's maybe a greater, because I mean, everybody has like their unique things about their culture that they want to hire for, but the uniquely more challenging parts of the job when you're remote, in particular, like what you described with tone and empathy, et cetera, like the prioritization of that as a quality is a little bit higher. I mean, I can imagine that there are some companies that, kind of settle for somebody who is a little bit, who has low EQ, but is like a phenomenal programmer. There are some companies that would make that higher, but when you're in a remote environment, you may encounter more challenges doing that.
Yeah, I have a no brilliant jerks rule. Like I just it's just not worth it. And
Me too.
I, I mean that's just I mean that's a good behavior anyway, whether you're remote or not. But it's exacerbated really dramatically when you're remote. You have to be able to communicate. Like in remote, you have to be good at written communication, verbal communication. We do a ton of writing at Zapier. It's very part of it, very much part of the culture, and you just have to be really good at that. If you're not, if you don't like to read and write, you're going to have a hard time in this environment. So.
Totally makes sense. Awesome. So, I was mentioning this kind of at the very beginning while people were still coming in, but as we're thinking more about reopening and we're thinking more about the future. This question is: are there any specific policies that you've implemented, either specifically for COVID? Do you even have any specifically for COVID policies? I'm curious, given that you've been remote, or more generally for remote working that you'd like to keep as the world returns back to normal.
Yeah, we leaned in really heavily. So Zapier by default is very transparent, very empathetic, right? That I said that at the beginning. That's a part of our interview process. It ratcheted up a notch with COVID for sure. So on the transparency front, the executive team, we basically started war rooming. So every day we would meet for at least a half an hour, look at the numbers for the day, the overnight numbers, talk about what's happening in the organization, try to make decisions, and then we would communicate that out every single day. We have an internal blogging platform that we use for company communications, and everyone publishes to it. And so the CEO Wade would publish every night, here's what we talked about today in our executive check-in. Here's some decisions we've made. And I've promised to put our employees first and to be fully transparent about how the business is doing. And that's at the beginning of every post. This has been wildly popular. And Wade is already incredibly transparent, but like this was up another notch. And we all contribute to this in the executive team. And the consistent feedback we've heard is, I just really feel like you're paying attention and that you seriously have the employees on your mind all the time and the business on your mind all the time. And we just feel like you're communicating really well. On the empathy front, we did several things. So there, People Ops and Learning and Development launched a variety of things that help with mental health, about how to manage stress, and grief and stuff like that as we're going through this. We added some templates to our one-on-one tool that we use for tracking one-on-ones. That's a template for questions that managers can ask their employees to see how they're doing. And we got very explicit with folks saying, if you have a home life situation where you have other distractions, you're taking care of someone who's sick or you're taking care of your kids, you need to be totally transparent and honest with your manager, saying, this is my home life situation. This is what I can and can't do from a time commitment perspective. And we'll just adapt to that. I said, but you've got to tell us so that we know, and so that you don't feel like you just have to squeeze it in and you're exhausted all the time. So those are some COVID specific policies, but it's a developing muscle for sure. And I think the level of transparency that we have now will just keep continuing to do that as we go forward.
Yeah, so this is interesting hearing that there's a lot of enthusiasm for this level of communication. I mean, obviously people are kind of like, what's going on? And just having that level of communication now is valuable. Is that something that you think that will persist, that level of kind of daily updates and like really frequent, the internal blogging you were mentioning? Or do you think that as the worry dies down, maybe things will go back to the way they were before?
So with our internal blogging, everybody publishes something every week anyway. So that's a normal routine that we have. We do Friday updates, and usually it's talking about what you got done and what you're going to do next week and what you're doing on the weekend. It's just kind of a check-in, mostly directed at your manager and your team. So those they existed pre-COVID and they'll exist afterwards. I doubt that the executive team will be war rooming every day for the rest of the year. That seems unlikely. And we don't always make decisions every single day. Like we make decisions a lot, but we don't make them necessarily that frequently. So I don't think we will need to do that. The company financials are transparent for the whole company, so you can see that anytime you want. We've just been we've been providing a lot more commentary about it daily as things have changed, as MRR has moved up and down over the course of the past 6 weeks. So that's the part that we probably won't have to comment on as much when we get out of this.
Yep, that makes sense. I'm reminded of Principles by Ray Dalio, the book that is about Bridgewater, who has this similarly very transparent kind of culture, and they publish every single meeting, they record the audio of every single meeting, they publish it to every single person in the company regardless of what the meeting is, which is kind of like the true extreme of transparency. And hearing that story, just for those who are kind of more interested in like deeper reading on transparency as a topic and cultural impact of transparency, it's an interesting story, so I mentioned it on the side. So kind of going back to the previous question there, it looks like there's interest again in the hiring front, and kind of assessment and with respect to remote work. So writing skills like long form and chat seem to be a lot more important in distributed teams, as you were mentioning, than co-located teams. How do you account for that or assess for that in your hiring and training?
Yeah, so we don't do the logical answer to that would be some kind of writing assignment, right? We really don't do that for engineers. The writing assignment that we do is a coding assignment, right? So you have to solve a particular coding challenge depending on which discipline you're being hired into. I joke, I made a joke once that Zapier is an English class with a company wrapped around it. Like we do so much writing, and it's, you really have to be crisp and concise and very clear. There's a book called Writing Without Bullshit that I recommend that has a lot of good tips for writing really good prose when you're trying to convey information to other people. I thought I was a good writer when I came here, and I have continued to develop my skills. The answer to the question is that we look for good communication skills verbally when we're interviewing. We look for good coding skills, and people learn to do the writing, I think, is the best way to describe it. They learn to write these weekly updates. They learn how to communicate in Slack. Everybody uses Slack anyway, whether you're remote or not. So that's not a muscle people typically have to train, right? But people learn to get better at this. And one of the ways that we train people is, and this happens at the executive team all the way down, is when I'm going to publish something big that's like a stake in the ground I want to place for the engineering organization or something like that, I put it in front of the executive team and I put it in front of my leadership team, and they bleed all over it. It's like I said, it's like writing an English paper, and people go in there and they correct your grammar, they correct the wording, they suggest like, this makes no sense, what is this here? It's like co-editing a paper together, and that's how we write. And that's how we train people to communicate, which I've never experienced before in a professional environment. I've never experienced it before. I've certainly had it in school, but so that's one of the ways I think we train for writing. But if you can't communicate verbally, you're probably not getting through the interview process. So
it sounds like verbal communication is really the priority. And I guess the reality is if for some reason you don't have great writing skills when you come in, like at the least, you can have conversations verbally, via Zoom, Slack, video chat, whatever. So you can, especially as an individual contributor, you can still be effective from a communication standpoint if you have that as a bare minimum, but right. But you can be trained, and that makes sense. Great. So switching gears a little bit, what special challenges are there transitioning from partially remote to 100% remote? I imagine that there are companies who are assessing now that they've been 100% remote, like maybe this could work for us long term. I don't know if you've ever gone through that particular transition, but if you were to think about how to make that transition, any special challenges?
So I have not been through this transition personally. I can speculate what some of the challenges will be. Your tooling is really, really critical in a fully remote environment, and so that's your communications tooling. Whether it's Slack and how you do documentation of record stuff. We have a bunch of custom tooling that we've built to be a remote company successfully. If that stuff is not in place, you'll have to get that in place to transition to fully remote, because you just won't have the mechanics down. When it comes to engineering, it's especially true. I mean, again, almost all of us use GitHub, Jira, or something similar, or GitLab, et cetera, for the mechanics. But if you don't have a good CI/CD pipeline and automatic deployments and stuff like that stuff is going to need to be built. If you don't have a good incident response plan for what happens when everybody's distributed, you can't like rally people in an office when there's an outage. Like that stuff's got to be prepared for as well. I would say that's the challenge is the real challenges of moving to remote are sort of learning to communicate differently. I think and that's less about tooling and more about a mindset of, like if you have a Zoom conversation, for example, chances are someone's going to want to know the information that you just talked about. And so there's a little bit of okay, who else do I need to tell about this conversation so that I catch everybody up? So that means, like, I just had a conversation this morning about a microservices architecture. I'm like, okay, now I need to go just debrief on this conversation in a channel saying, hey, a few of us just talked about this. We're going to continue the conversation here, but we wanted you to know that this thing went on. Like that kind of behavior is a good thing to practice when you're fully remote. And that's probably not something you even think about when you're in a co-located environment, even though you should still do it because chances are someone wasn't in the room and needed to hear it.
Sure. No, that makes sense. What do you think about people working long hours right now because there's not much else to do during the quarantine? Do you feel a need to intervene or just let people manage themselves? I'm sure there are people that they're like, I've ran out of Netflix to watch. I've ran out of video games to play. I don't want to interact with the people around me that I'm like so sick of being around for the last several weeks. But maybe they're actually enjoying their work enough that they want to dive into it out of their own choice. Do you do anything about that? Do you leave it as is? What are your thoughts on that?
So I have a couple of answers. The first thing is in manager one-on-ones, getting a health check on people is really important right now. It's generally important to ask how people are doing, but especially right now, managers have to say, how's your week? How are you feeling? We use a red, yellow, green check-in daily with the exec team. I do it weekly with my team. We just, tell us how you're feeling. Green's great, yellow, feeling frustrated or a little anxiety, red, I've got a blocker, I'm really upset about something. Like, you have to have that kind of check-in regularly with folks, just generally to see how they're doing. Someone also created a Zap that looks for people who are online at Slack. We're well outside of their office hours and sends them a message telling them to stop working, which was kind of a cool idea too. The thing, I think you have to treat people as adults here too, because people's home situations may be such that they need to disappear for 2 hours in the middle of the day, and they feel like they want to make that time up in the evening. And what we ask out of people is, if possible, right now, work 40 hours, but try not to burn yourself out. We always talk about running marathons, not sprints here at Zapier, and we want people in it for the long haul. So that said, it's an ongoing thing for people. Have a strong sense of ownership here, and they want to get their work done and they want to accomplish. And so you definitely have to remind people of this. So I like the Zap idea because it's automated, right? You don't have to, it just fires when someone's online.
Yeah. It's interesting though, like the core essence of what you're saying makes me reflect on really the critical piece is the creating the connection and checking in. And even like the reminder there just to say, hey, like, are you, that's healthy. But sometimes folks that, thank goodness, work-life balance is a little bit more in vogue than it was, at least in 2008, right? When that said, sometimes managers are like, no, you have to stop working because work-life balance is so important, et cetera. But they forget what you were describing earlier, which is that there are times when people actually use work as a coping mechanism, and that's why there are workaholics just as there are alcoholics and whatever aholics. And it reminds me of a time I had an engineer on my team that her father passed away, and the last thing I wanted to do was to expect any work whatsoever, and wanted to encourage taking time off, et cetera. But it's interesting that sometimes in trauma, work gives you a sense of purpose that allows you to focus and put your energy into something that allows you to forget, and can sometimes be therapeutic as it relates to dealing with it. So in some ways it's like, well, it's good to check in and to connect and to make sure that people are doing okay. That doesn't necessarily mean that that if they're working an unreasonable number of hours, that's necessarily a bad thing for them. It could actually be a useful thing for them.
That's right. I think the key though is that the culture you don't want to create is an expectation where everyone must work 60+ hours a week.
Right.
Not in a when you're running a marathon. If you're trying to get something out the door, perhaps, and you're really trying to buckle down on something, I could see an argument for that occasionally. But as a general rule, people need balance in their lives.
Yep.
So the other thing that uh, good professionals have a strong sense of ownership of the stuff that they're doing, and they feel a strong sense of need to get it done and do it right. And sometimes there'll be a life event and they need to hear someone say, it's okay, like you go focus on that life event. This happened recently here. Someone had a fairly serious medical issue in their family, and the manager said to them, you need to have the headspace to focus on this. It's really important to me that you have the headspace. You're a fantastic worker and you're super tough. This is not the time to just buckle down and try to get everything done. Like, take care of your family. We'll be here and we'll work around whatever you need. Like, that's an important message that you need to say to even to seasoned professionals. So that's not just a COVID thing. That's a thing that you should get in the habit of doing all the time.
Yep. Like sometimes somebody's behavior and how they work is dramatically impacted, whether they realize it or not, by trauma they may be experiencing. And sometimes you actually have to ask them to stop, because even if they're working longer hours, the work quality might be impacted negatively enough that it's not worth it. Yeah, that makes sense. So this is an interesting one. I imagine, given what you were talking about like tooling, that there's probably also kind of unique methodologies or tools that you use as a fully remote company that allow you to simulate or somehow replace things that would normally be done in person. So in that context, someone was curious about what substitute do you suggest for gathering around a whiteboard, for example, in design brainstorming?
Yeah, we use a bunch of different things. We use a Mural for retrospectives and for whiteboarding. We use Lucidchart for that as well. We use Figma for design, specifically for design ideation. We use a ton of stuff with Figma, both for the initial ideation and for clickable prototypes. And then people have some of their favorite like collaborative draw programs too. So there's so many choices out there that like just recommending one doesn't make a lot of sense. We also integrate with a bunch of them too, right? So as a company, what used to be even like, I don't know, 8-10 years ago, it was a dearth of choices. Right now it's a plethora, and you just have to find a few that work for you. I personally spend more time in shared editing environments like Google Docs or Coda or something like that, because we're producing information-rich documentation. I spend less time like in like Mural or Figma while someone else is in there. I mean, I spend a lot of time looking through stuff that people have produced, but I don't spend as much time collaborating there. And Lucid, we use a lot for engineering, drawing, and stuff like that too. So those are some tools I would recommend.
Those are great recommendations. I've been living in the, with my co-founder in like, early design phases of our work. And that's funny because like the design program of choice tends to change, right? It used to be Photoshop for years, and then it's Sketch, and then now everyone's using Figma. And it's like, if you want to be the latest and greatest, you got to use the latest and greatest tool. And we've been using Figma, having never used it before, and the live being able to edit this on the same screen and have it be really real time is actually really, really phenomenal. So in terms of at least like UI, UX design prototyping stuff, like Figma is quite cool. We tried using Balsamiq, to use for wireframing, and I will say, not so happy about some of the like using it at the same time types of features, because if you're working on the same screen and somebody makes an edit, then it undoes whatever edits were in progress from the other person. So I hope one day they fix that.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't used Balsamiq in a while, but I have to check it out.
Yeah, I mean, and it's true. There are so many choices. So it's like, worst thing you can do is try it, with the peer. If it doesn't work, then try something else. Awesome. So this is like totally shifting gears, but it's interesting because this one came up in the last AMA that we had as well, and it's actually relevant to some of the stuff we're looking at our startup. But a lot of folks, particularly new managers, have trouble knowing if they're paying their employees like the right amount. Trouble with like leveling and compensation in general. And so the question is, for comp scaling, what's your strategy? Do you acknowledging and related to remote work in particular, right? Do you pin comp to HQ? Do you pin it to one location? Do you sign it locally and everyone's unique and look at some kind of third-party tool about like cost of living? Like, how do you assess it when everybody's remote?
Yeah, this is a really tough one for fully remote companies. The short answer is it's in between. Like, it's not fully pinned to locale, and it's not pinned to one location. That's how Zapier does it now. So we have some level of regional adjustment. We're international in 20 something countries, 24 countries, I think. And so we have well, the workforce is entirely global. So we have regional variation that's based on data, that's based on regional data, but it's not like localized to a particular city. Like it's not that granular yet. We're in the process of hiring. So what companies, like for the first couple hundred people, you're typically figuring this out yourself. And then at some point you're like, okay, it's gotten too complex now we have to hire somebody. We're at that phase. So we're hiring a comp expert now that does international comp that will help us more formalize this. The important thing I want to point out though is that we do have career levels and we do have assigned bands, and those levels and those bands there are multiple bands depending on geo. So it's actually pretty sophisticated. It's not localized to a specific city. And we've started, like most companies, we started looking at data like Radford, like the Radford data set, to start doing this, but that data is helpful in some contexts. It's not always great for some of the international geos. It doesn't necessarily, it's an average, right? So there's a policy setting aspect to it where you have to say, we're gonna pay a certain percentile of maybe what Radford says. In some cases, we might say, we're going to pay so much beyond Radford because we just want to find the best people wherever they are. And that's another policy one can adopt too. So I don't have a single answer for you here because companies vary wildly in how they do this. But I will tell you that even at Zapier's size, we have a fairly sophisticated model already to try to recognize different geos. That said, we really like to hire from all over. You don't have, the thing that's great about remote is you don't have to hire from Boston or San Francisco or New York City or whatever. You can hire from anywhere. So we have delocation options, like for people who want to move somewhere else, like maybe they grew up in the Midwest and they took a stint in San Francisco and they want to move back. Like we have delocation packages that get them moved back and give them a job too. So that's an important thing for us, is that we want to make sure that we find people everywhere and we hire them everywhere.
So if somebody, I mean, totally understand the complications of this, right? I'm actually curious though as a policy, because we had this kind of debate at doctor.com. Like if somebody lives in San Francisco and they move to a place with a very low cost of living, or vice versa, do you actually change their comp and like bring it up or bring it down when they make that move?
Yeah, it's a great question that we haven't resolved yet. I don't have a strong I don't have a strong opinion here, so I probably should not weigh in yet. I think I want to see some data first. We don't have a ton of examples of this at Zapier right now. It's a little bit more real when you're talking to a human who's making this decision than it is to make a policy decision for 100 people, for example. So right now, I would probably default to talking to the person and understanding the situation about their moving somewhere.
Totally makes sense, because if your choice to move is literally because you want to make more money, you know, that's maybe a different warrants a different kind of decision versus you know, you have to take care of a sick relative that happens to live in a place that's way more expensive,
right?
More compassionate, right? So
that's right.
Fascinating. Well, one of the sort of core call outs from what you described, even though it is complicated, is like this concept of leveling, right? That you have some kind of leveling system, and that there's comp bands that are attached to those levels, and that you adjust them as best you can based off of location, based off of whatever kind of location data that you can get. And what you described is, you know, resonates with what I've heard from other organizations. Actually, I was just talking with somebody who does compensation at a very large 7,000-ish person startup, and they were mentioning that they have like, you know, for each level, they have like a pinned rate for like a pinned level band for a particular kind of default location, let's call it New York. And then, you know, in San Francisco, it's whatever, 10, 15% more. In Atlanta, it's like whatever, minus 10%, you know, et cetera. And that they have like a fixed set of locations, but you don't have like 1,000 locations. Like they picked like 10, and then there's everybody else. So like, and like Portland is the default if you're like anywhere else. So if you happen to live in Texas, you know, you might be actually getting lucky in terms of that decision. But like with any policy, sometimes you have to do the 80-20 of keeping things relatively simple, just so you can like not be totally overwhelmed, right?
That's right. And the last time I did a comping exercise, that's basically what I did. There were a handful of geos that in the US that we had like 6 regions or something in the US, and that's all we did. It's more complicated internationally though. There's quite a bit of variation. Like you can't even, just like with the US, you can't localize to the US. You can't localize to like one place in Europe or one place in Asia or one place in Africa. Like you can't do that. So it gets far more complicated as you go international, and that's typically why when you need some help, because there's a bunch of market data that you have to be able to gather that most people just don't have and don't have the capacity to gather.
Totally. I mean, like the Radford, for the, those who aren't familiar, right? Radford is this like great survey rich data set that Doug was mentioning. And like that data set, like it's, it's in the tens of thousands of dollars kind of cost to be able to afford that data set. So, and, you can go to Glassdoor, which can be kind of useful, but not quite, because you don't get levels when you see senior or just software engineer. It's such a, it's a tough one. One of the things I feel remiss in not saying this before we move on is, at least when you're looking at comp, right, the amount of imbalance that's out there as it relates to gender and, ethnicity, race, et cetera, is a thing to pay attention to. So if you do nothing else, it's like run a report and compare, right? Look at your women, look at your people of color, compare, and make sure that there aren't disparities there, because those are the things that, nobody identifies, as a racist or a sexist, but they somehow inevitably look at their data set, and by some strange phenomenon, they find that they're in this position. If you don't actually look and you don't do that work, it won't actually happen. So it's good to do
Yeah,
that
for
work.
sure. And also set goals, hiring goals in general, like track what your diversity goals are. We have OKRs around how we hire in diversity, and it's important for the recruiting team. It's important for leadership. We want to reflect society, so we hire for that.
Awesome. Very cool. All right. How do you make sure as you grow a remote team that code base coherence and quality is maintained?
I'm gonna maybe say something controversial in that in the long run you don't there are scalability inflection points in an organization, and to move fast, if you drive for consistency, you won't be able to move fast all the time. So like we're going through this now as we break up our monolith into a services architecture, right? The intention behind breaking that up is to have guardrails for what's allowed and how to use orchestration and how to communicate to other services, but ultimately to give teams freedom in how they build their services in order to give them control over what they're building and the ability to build quickly. So yes, there's stuff like checking for code formatting and having end-to-end tests as part of your deployment pipeline, and ensuring that people are doing the basics to get stuff built and deployed. And that's just good CI/CD pipeline behavior. But if you're looking for like perfect coherence and perfect alignment on architecture, you're gonna spend all your time on architecture. And I think I don't think that's time well spent if you're trying to grow quickly. I think you have to have a bigger architectural vision. You have to have some good guardrails, some principles. Like one of our chief architects here at Zapier put together a great list of sort of 8 principles for building new systems for us, and they're high level guardrails for how we expect the systems to be built. Like that's the end state that we're trying to get to, not perfect coherence. We're not building the software for this space shuttle or something like that, where every line of code has to be checked. Like we're trying to move quick in a SaaS environment. So different rules.
I love that, and I controversial or not, like it makes sense. It's interesting because when when new engineering managers come in, sometimes they learn about like the problems of having technical debt and how do you reduce your technical debt and fix technical debt, blah blah blah. But it's not often that you hear the conversation about like the benefit, the value, the use of technical debt as this like good tool, in your arsenal that you can actually like consciously take, when you're putting out something. For example, you want to put out like a minimum viable product, you're pushing out something that is solving a very severe issue, right? I mean, it's like, like if you're Zoom and you have like a bunch of crazy folks clamoring about security, like rather than waiting 6 months to resolve it with like the perfect solution, it's like you got to find a way to get something out the door, and maybe you put some really hacky code that isn't architected super well, but you know it's
Right.
secure at least, like, and you just push it out, right? And then you pay the technical debt later. It's I think it is an art form to know like when to incur technical debt, right? And like when to pay it off.
Yeah. So something we talked about this year is the difference between prototyping and productizing. And when you're in a prototyping mode on something, you're creating by definition throwaway. You're experimenting in a particular area to see if something's going to work. And one of the things we've been trying to encourage people is to label what state they're in. We're prototyping this. This is an experiment. We're probably going to end up throwing this away and rebuilding it if it works correctly. If we're productizing, then we're hardening something for production and scale that we're going to be supporting long term. The key here is that when you flip the bit between prototyping and productizing, you have to mentally say, okay, this is no longer throwaway code. And the other key is when you're done prototyping, if it's not something that you intend to keep, you need to get it out of the code base. And this is not something this is not something we're great at just yet, but the message is like, if you're done with that, just throw it away. Like copy it into another repo, like get it out of there. It doesn't have to go away forever. It just has to be out of the main code base so that the cruft doesn't build up. The bigger issue here is a monolith. Like when you have a monolith and all this stuff starts getting added to it, then it's hard to know. And there are multiple paths to solve the same problem. That's when it gets complicated. But so we're separating that out too. But additionally, there's this other behavior of just when you get to that decision point, either throw it away or double down on it and start productizing. And we're still figuring this out. I'm not going to say that we've nailed this, but philosophically, this is something we're trying to do right now.
Awesome. Awesome. We have about 10 minutes left. This next question is like a complete shifting of gears. It actually gets a little bit more personal. If we think about, people talk about, it's not work-life balance anymore. It's work-life integration, right? This question is, what are your personal core values as a professional engineer and manager?
Personal core values. So I want my work and everybody else's work to be fulfilling, right? I think that's an important part of the job because fulfillment leads to motivation and leads to commitment and leads to engagement and leads to caring about the customers. Like it's such a core thing that people should be passionate about. And at the risk of like those of you who are working on products you don't like, if you don't like the product you're working on, you're probably at the wrong company. Like, don't just take a paycheck. Don't just, some engineers can usually like find something technically interesting, even if the product they're not interested in. And that's good. Like if you can anchor on that, that's great. But you should really, really love the product because ultimately you need to love your customers because they're the ones paying your salary, right? They're the ones that are making a company successful and the reason you have a job. So I think that fulfillment is a really core value for me. I definitely believe in servant leadership. I think that my job is to help other people be successful. And when I'm not doing that, that's when I feel the most level of personal stress. When I feel like I'm not operating at that level and helping others resolve problems and chart their own course and whatnot, that's when I feel stress. So that's another thing as a professional that I feel. A lot of Zapier's values, one of the things that attracted me to Zapier is that the values are very aligned with me personally. Like empathy, no ego, and default to transparency and default to action they're all really core things for me. Like I think that's just a good way to behave as a human being, and I like that a lot. The other thing I would say is that you need to keep growing. It took me a while to like name this thing that you should always be sort of figuring out how to grow as a human being, professionally, personally. Should constantly be like evaluating and learning from your experiences. One of Zapier's fourth value, growth through feedback, is exactly that. It's like people are here to help you be successful, and they're going to say hard things to you when something's not working right? Like, or when you did something, you're like, why in the heck did you do that? Like they want to, but they say it in a supportive way. Like, we're trying to help you grow. We want you to be successful. And this is the feedback we're giving to you. That's become a very, very core value for me. Like just constantly focusing on how to be a better leader and a better human. And I think that's an important part of the job. If you're managing and that's not a core part of like trying to be a better leader, if that's not a core part of what you're doing, please get out of management. Like go back to IC work. It's just as valuable. The career paths are parallel. We need brilliant engineers, but if you don't like the people work, then don't do it.
That's very well said. I totally agree. And you know, it's true. Most companies these days, particularly anyone that like kind of models the ladder, right? The software engineering growth ladder, like, you know, the Googles and the Facebooks, et cetera, of the world, they have that parallel career path, right? It's not the old school days where like, if you want to grow, you got to become a manager. You can be a very senior individual contributor and make just as much money and like have just as much respect, et cetera,
That's
as
right.
like a director or whatever. So
that's exactly how we designed it at Zapier. Like they're exactly parallel tracks. The levels they even have some equivalency of titling. They definitely have equivalency of comp. Like that's really critical. So one of the questions I often have with managers that are sort of early in the process is sort of, how's it going and are you liking what you're doing, right? Because it's easy to feel the pull of, well, geez, should I stay in the management track because it feels like I have more control, which is a fallacy of leadership because you don't actually have control. And then there's they feel the pull of the engineering work and being able to build and create. And so those existential moments are fun conversations to have, because I am a firm believer in making sure people are in the right path and making sure both of those paths have prestige and high expectations and visibility and all that other good stuff.
there you go. We have time for one more question. So this one, I think probably a lot of people are going to want to know the answer to, because it's probably something that you all have that you'll do way more effectively as a company that's been remote for so long, which is, what's your guidance on when to use different communication mediums? When do you use Slack? When do you Zoom? When do you write a long form essay? You know, and if you do you send it in an email or post it on a wiki? Like, how do you know what form to use? How do you guide others to know what form to use?
Yeah, this is the hardest problem of modern work life. Slack is meant to be the sort of office space where you have asynchronous communication. It's not meant to be the statement of record for stuff. So when you need when we need a decision made, we need an architectural plan, when you need an org chart, you go from Slack to a document, a record system, where you say, this is what we're going to do. We make heavy use of DAISYs here, where you decision-making framework, you know, DAISY for things that we need. We've had a lot of debate on Slack, or we've had some debate on Zoom. Now we got to get to a decision. Here's the DAISY. And then the decision options are enumerated there, and it's someone's job to gather all the information and force people to make a decision. We don't use email here at Zapier at all. Like it's used for talking to external folks, but I very rarely check my email. So I often find stuff in there from a week ago. I'm like, oh, I should have responded to that, but it's because nothing happens over there inside the company. It's done entirely with Slack, with our various documentations of record, and with our internal blogging tool. So some people use a wiki. We have an internal blogging tool. The long form stuff goes into our internal blogging tool. It's called Async, and the long form stuff goes into that. So if you're saying we did this big release, here's some videos, here's some screenshots, here's what we did. That's all in Async. We're doing this big policy change. We talk about that in Async. We're doing an org structure change. We talk about that in Async, and then we have links to the org charts. So Async is how you keep your pulse on the finger of the company, and that's a finger on the pulse of the company. Sorry, and that's how we do it. So some people might use email for that, but email is not a good broadcast mechanism. It's kind of an antiquated technology, honestly, these days. So definitely recommend using some other, you know, dashboarding style tool for long form text that people can read for that.
That's fascinating. I think I mean, I certainly have heard many folks say email is an antiquated technology, but I think you're the first larger company that I've, you know, heard of that literally just like really doesn't really use email. It's interesting because something Mustafa and I, you know, we have a lot of interaction, and I've told him in the past, you know, because they'll Slack me for things, and I've told him in the past, like, if you need to interrupt me, use Slack, but if you don't want to interrupt me, use email. And part of the reason for that is because one of the downsides of Slack is that it's an interruption mechanism. So if you have it on constantly, you want to be available, you're constantly getting interrupted. But that said, I guess really what it's about is like being conscious about these choices, communicating and having a clear conversation and an agreement about those choices. I had to say to Mustafa, hey, if you have something that you want an immediate reply that's urgent, send it via Slack, but otherwise send it via email. For me, that's useful, but I'm also like a hyper organized person, so email works for me, but it's not true.
Yeah. So here's how we would do that. you're supposed to, if you need focus time, you're supposed to mute Slack. Some people even close the app so that they're not. And then if someone really needs you, they can push through the snooze. But that keeps everything in Slack. And then you just, when you come up for air, you turn Slack back on, then you can catch up. So that's how we would do that.
There you go. So you just need agreement. You need to consciously discuss this, and you need to consciously think about it instead of just using the medium you're using just because you're going to use it. So with that, we're at time. I want to thank you so much, Doug. It was very interesting, informative, stimulating. Thank you for